Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our first panel, Global Challenges and Trends. Our moderator will be Gillian Tett, Assistant Editor with Financial Times. She is joined by panelists Peter Sands, Group CEO, Standard Chartered, Jane Harman, Director, President, and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center, and John Huntsman, Chairman, Atlantic Council, and former U.S. Ambassador to China.
Well, good morning, everybody. I think this is working. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this first panel session of this conference. I would imagine many of you sitting here today are feeling moderately cheerful because not only is it a fabulous spring day here in Washington, we've also seen growing signs of growth returning, not just in America, but across the world. Those of you who were following the recent IMF World Bank conferences may know that the IMF recently raised its forecast for global growth this year to 3.7%, and it's predicting 3.9% next year, which is not necessarily a reason to crack open the champagne, but it's certainly a lot better than the picture has looked in recent years. But the big question which hangs over the global economy right now is whether this is going to be just another false spring. Because the reality is that we've had signs of spring in every sense in recent years, and on every occasion in the last 4 years, these have turned out to be a disappointment. Many of you remember how optimistic everyone was feeling a few years ago when then the Fukushima tragedy happened in Japan and knocked global growth back. Then we had the Eurozone crisis, not once but twice, slowing down global growth. And then last year, we had an explosion of concern about emerging markets. I remember going to the IMF World Bank meetings last autumn, and a very interesting switch had occurred because in the previous 2 or 3 years, the sessions which had been completely jam-packed and standing room only were the sessions about the Eurozone crisis. Last autumn, the sessions which had standing room only were the ones about emerging markets, because a lot of people were very concerned that growth was slowing down rapidly there. So the question right now is, are we finally seeing a proper spring? Are we finally moving into a real post-crisis phase when we can put the shocks of 2008 behind us? Or is there something else on the horizon this year that's going to trip up global growth once again? And we have a great panel to discuss this. I'm going to start on my immediate left, your right, with Peter Sands, CEO of Standard Chartered Bank, because he's somebody who's very deeply involved with the situation with emerging markets around the world and is very much at the forefront of trying to work out whether growth is for real or whether the emerging markets are now presenting a risk to growth rather than a boost. And then I'll turn to Senator Huntsman and Jane Harman to get your views about how you see the current outlook for growth and what people in this audience should be expecting for this year. But Peter, what's your view about the emerging markets concerns? I mean, do you think that we can still look to the emerging markets to really power growth this year? Or are you concerned that much of the optimism before is basically running out of steam?
Well, let me start by giving my sort of broader view on the global outlook, because I am in the position of being on the side of the somewhat more optimistic, which is not to underestimate the risks to global growth. But when you've got a situation where GDP growth in the US is looking pretty good, what you can say about the Eurozone is at least it isn't going backwards, which is a positive. Japan has surprised on the upside, and China, I'm not in the camp that thinks it's all going to go into a hard landing. I think China will deliver at least 7% growth. And they've got all sorts of challenges, but they also have a pretty good grip on how they're going to go about tackling them. However, I think you could easily see a situation where GDP growth is quite good, trade and investment is quite good, but financial markets don't like it. Because the financial markets are being driven more by the dynamics of tapering, the end of QE, and all this sort of stuff. And that's particularly the case with respect to emerging markets, where you have seen since last May a really negative stance on emerging markets from the financial world, and indeed the media world has tended to follow that direction.
If in doubt, blame journalists, yes.
Well, exactly. But what's interesting is when we talk to our clients, and our clients range from big Asian companies, but they're also big American companies, big European companies doing business across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. And you ask them where their growth is going to come from in the next 5, 10 years. Actually, most of their growth is going to come from emerging markets. And so there's a bit of a disconnect between actors in the real economy who are still saying most of the world's growth, because most of the world's growth in consumption is going to happen in the emerging world, at the same time as financial markets have decided that the emerging world has suddenly become a huge problem. And I think there's a number of things that is driving that. One is that the dynamics of the withdrawal of, or the gradual sort of normalization of the extraordinary central bank policies we've had since the crisis are very difficult to predict how they're going to work out. And financial markets are incredibly jumpy about that. And the problem here is, while most of this happened in the Western world, because the financial markets in the emerging world are so much smaller, small ripples from what are happening, decisions by the Fed or the European Central Bank, turn into big waves when they hit countries like Kenya or Malaysia or even India. So there's that financial dynamic. The second is some of the big emerging markets are going through really quite dramatic transitions in the shape of the economy. And the most obvious example of that is China, where you're seeing a massive rebalancing of the Chinese economy. And there's all sorts of pain points and pressure points and bumps that will happen during that transition. And the problem with China is you can find a proof point for pretty well any thesis you want, because there are white elephant infrastructures, right. There are roads to nowhere, there is overcapacity. On the other hand, there is also places where there are acute shortages of housing, where the infrastructure is overstretched, and there is massive undercapacity in the provision of services. So sort of almost everything is true depending on the hypothesis you want to take. I do think politics is where a lot of the risk to growth is, and that's both at the level of individual countries, where, so if I take Asia, you've got some very big elections happening right now, which could really have quite a profound impact on countries as big as India and Indonesia, for example. And then clearly geopolitics. There will be others who probably can comment with more insight than me on the dynamics of the situation around the Ukraine. But quite apart from the direct impact of the concerns around the Ukraine, the indirect impact on people's sort of sense of confidence about how the geopolitics works. That could, I think, if you're looking for a source of where this could turn into a false spring, it would be because geopolitics upsets people's confidence.
Right.
I'll stop there.
Okay, well, that's a lot of issues to unpack there. But in a nutshell, you're saying, don't believe the journalists, don't believe the financial markets. It looks much better than it actually is, effectively.
Yeah, and I'm a banker.
Great. Well, I'm sure there's plenty of people in the room who would agree with that. But, I mean, out of those complex of issues, China is perhaps the one which provokes most debate of all at the moment, because the Chinese economy has become so critical to the global economy recently, not just as a competitor to the US, but also as a source of demand as well, and a driver of growth. So Senator Huntsman, as someone who has spent a lot of time looking at China and the China-US relationship, how do you assess the stability of the current Chinese economy? Do you think that it's potentially heading for a slowdown, and could that create problems for the US?
Well, we're fundamentally entering a new phase. Where we're going as a global economy, I mean, the stepping off point here is not unlike 1815, after the Treaty of Paris, or 1914, or 1945, or 1989. The question for China and for the United States really will be, does it look like the post-1914 world or the post-1945 world, where you had institutions that supported growth and you had real leadership on the world stage? So that takes me to China, where I believe you do have some serious leadership now steering the policy direction of their country. You've seen the rise, the emergence of Xi Jinping who's the 5th generation of leadership after Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping and Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Now you've got Xi Jinping, 61 years old, son of Xi Jinping, who was imprisoned by Mao because of his reform-minded tendencies. So he has reform kind of running through his DNA. And he wakes up every morning and he surveys the landscape of 1.3 billion people surrounded by 14 or 15 nation states, some of them fairly unpredictable and hostile. And he's looking at how he maintains 7.5% growth, because if he doesn't, he'll have political instability, which could be disastrous for China's future. And he knows he has to keep his foot on the gas pedal. And that, to some extent, will ensure that China will remain an engine of growth, increasingly less an exporter, driven by their investment export model, and more an importer, driven by the need to consume by expanding their commercial base and driving incomes up the ladder. Entrepreneurship and innovation, creating more research universities. This will all be part of their future. But what I'm impressed with is the fact that the first time in 10 years you actually have a leader who's doing something in China. I would argue that you had 10 years under Hu Jintao of failed leadership, largely because of infighting within the Communist Party, largely because of the economic turmoil which confronted him about halfway through his 10-year term. And now you've got a man consolidating power like no one since Deng Xiaoping, since probably 78, 79 period. He's won over the party, 75, 80 million people in 3,500 outposts across the country. He's won over the PLA because he has military experience. He worked for Minister Geng Biao in the late 70s and early 80s. And he's won over the princelings, which you need to win over to get anything done in China, because he is one himself. So he'll now look at debt, which is sizable, particularly in the provincial regions of the country, and he'll have to do something about it. And that will be very difficult, because he'll have to empower the provincial leaders and the municipal leaders to begin to take responsibility for that which is allocated to them, which means the 5-tier financing structure in the country will likely be consolidated, maybe to 3. And the ways in which dollars pass back and forth from the periphery to Beijing will have to be changed because of the corruption and because of the inefficiencies. And he'll have to look at the roaming population within the country, which is anywhere between 150 million and 200 million people, because of the collapse in the agricultural system, mostly people moving toward the big cities, where there will be stresses and strains on infrastructure, on the old hukou system, the way in which labor is allocated. And he'll have to fix retirement and health care and labor mobility, and all the while ensuring that he doesn't have restless elements of his population pop up in response to bad policies by the party. So he has a very, very difficult task ahead, but I believe he'll get there, because if you break down the standing committee, the 7 people there, all of whom are fairly credible and competent people, and then the 25 members of the Politburo, who are fairly dynamic, and more importantly, the 370 members of the Central Committee, who are some of the most competent people on the world stage I think I've ever encountered in financial and fiscal policies, but also in national security and military policy. So they have the leadership and the brain power to move forward. But I think most of all, the fact that Xi Jinping will have, between now and the 19th Party Congress, to consolidate power, which he's done a masterful job doing so far, and then between the 19th and the 20th Party Congresses, which will be another 5 years, really to implement his reform agenda, will give him the time, the power base, and hopefully the external environment, which is to say Northeast Asia, which is highly unpredictable, in order to get done when he needs to get done.
Right.
And that will spell opportunities for the United States, because we'll be exporting a whole lot more to China. China will become the largest export market for every city and every state in this country, and we'll have to figure out how best to navigate a pro-growth, pro-export policy in a country that really hasn't done so yet.
Well, that's an absolutely fascinating point. I'd love to come back to you later on and ask about how you actually go about doing that. You do underscore Peter Sand's point that really politics is becoming increasingly critical for working out where Asia is going right now. But I'm curious, I'd like to do a quick experiment. How many people in the room sitting here now have business which is linked to China? Yeah, well, that explains exactly why this is so critical. And I would imagine if you do that poll in a few years' time, that proportion will be even higher. But I'd like to turn to Jane now and just perhaps set this in a slightly bigger historical context, because it's very valuable, as Senator Huntsman says, to step back for a minute and try and look at this not just in terms of short-term trends or the timetable or what Congress is doing or the latest GDP forecast, but look at a bigger picture. Just to add to the sense of history, I think most of you in the room may not know that we actually have Chairman Hochberg's mother here today,
yes,
who in fact created a wonderful company that's been exporting over the years as well, and gives us an additional historical aspect of it. But Jane, when you look at the picture today, what do you make of the current outlook for global growth?
Well, let me first add to your shout out to Lillian Vernon. If anyone has not heard of Lillian Vernon, shame on you. And she built the company. Fred helped out, but hey, she built the company. Here she is.
Yeah.
So I was sitting here thinking that I'm a recovering politician, having served 9 terms in the United States Congress. John Huntsman did not serve in Congress. He ran a state and was an ambassador. So maybe his record is a little more successful than mine. But geopolitics does matter, and it would be nice to have China's growth continue for 5 years along the path that John has sketched. What about a possible war between China and Japan over a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea? Or what about the total implosion of Ukraine and feckless leadership possibly elsewhere, and no deal in the Middle East either with Iran or between Israel and Palestine, and the Arab winter becoming darker, etc. And what about all that, and how does that affect business? I mean, it seems to me that terrorism and the threat of war are not good for business and not good for economic growth, and we have to think about the context in which all of this happens. So here I am, as the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, which is a marvelous, pristine, and perfect expression of Woodrow Wilson's ideals, at least we try, and Fred Hochberg is on our board, so that makes it even better. And we look out across the world. We hope that through various alliances, these good economic trends will continue, but we see dark spots too, and I do think we have to put that out. Let me just make a couple comments about the U.S. role in this. I suppose I was an anachronism. I was a pro-trade, pro-defense Democrat who worked on a bipartisan basis in Congress. I think most of that doesn't resonate, thank you, with a lot of folks. But there are not that many folks in Congress right now who we could say are pro-trade in either party. I mean, the notion that Trade Promotion Authority, TPA, the mechanism by which Congress approves trade agreements on an up or down vote, has not only expired, but is now considered, at least for the short-term dead, is shocking to me. The best pivot to Asia for our country, it seems to me, would be robust trade with Asia, not just with China, but with all the countries in Asia, and that is what TPP is supposed to deliver. But there won't be a TPP if there isn't TPA. Similarly, with Europe, the best economic policy with Europe would be for TTIP to pass, but there won't be TTIP without TPA. And what worries me is that yesterday in the New York Times, a lead article said that the middle class in America is no longer the best off middle class. And it seems to me we're going to be left out if we don't step up our game. And that is why EXIM Bank and so many other, especially EXIM Bank, of course EXIM Bank matters. Fred, EXIM Bank matters. And it is very important on a bipartisan basis for Congress to support it. So we're not the only game in town. That's the first point. Second point, our economic power is our best foreign policy tool, both in terms of trade, but also in terms of our ability to exert sanctions against those who, preferably on a multilateral basis, those who are misbehaving in a variety of ways. The sanctions policy against Iran has been very effective. A sanctions policy against Russia, in my view, given its inappropriate conduct, first in Crimea and now threats against Ukraine and NATO allies, is very critical. And we have to step up that game too. And if we can think about economic power as a tool for peace in the world, I think that that puts our geopolitics in better order and allows for the kinds of things that Peter and John have just sketched out, which are obviously in the self-interest of the United States and in the interest of, it seems to me, people around the world.
So in practical terms, how concerned are you that there's going to be a backlash against trade over the next year or two?
How concerned am I?
Yes.
I'm very concerned through the midterm elections. That would be November of this year. And then I don't know what happens. I think it depends on who wins those elections. And I think it depends on leadership in the United States. It is more important, in my view, to do the right thing than to get reelected. And we need more people in elected office who put our country first. And if we think about it that way, what is really in America's interests, I would say short, medium, and long term, it is to engage with the economies of the world, and we can only do that through sensible and carefully constructed trade regimes. And that should be our foremost foreign policy tool, and I hope we get there.
Governor Huntsman, and apologies for either demoting or promoting you by calling you senator instead. You can choose which one you prefer.
I was downgraded temporarily. So.
To senator, okay? Well, you've now been...
But you can call me John.
Exactly.
There's a reality called politics that plays into our export posture and our view of the rest of the world. And sadly, when unemployment gets up 7, 8, 9%, we lose our sense of security. We become a bit insecure as a nation. So I governed a state when we had 2.5% unemployment, and we could do anything in terms of export initiatives, trade missions, public-private collaboration. And then overnight, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008, the bottom fell out, literally and figuratively, and things froze. And we lost our sense of confidence in 2008. And we're just barely beginning to recover that sense of confidence. And I think for anybody on Capitol Hill, for any policymaker, to try to get too far out front on trade initiatives, it becomes difficult until unemployment improves. I would argue you've got to have two things going for us in this nation to really hit it out of the ballpark. A, we've got to get unemployment down. We've got to regain our sense of confidence in this nation. And B, you've got to have leadership, like Jane mentioned, and she was terrific at it, with a sustained sense of the right policies, export-related policies, pro-growth policies, a sense of the world that speaks to confidence. And when you bring those two together, and we may be a couple of years away from that being the case, then I think we're back in the game. But right now, we still have some externalities that make it pretty difficult for most Americans really to kind of jump behind a strong pro-export, pro-trade policy.
Well, we are at least seeing unemployment inch down slowly. So the first part is there.
That's right.
Coming
That
on
will
the
change.
agenda.
That will
The
change.
second part, well, we can discuss that later. But Peter,
As the non-politician on the panel,
the banker is outnumbered.
I'd actually like to be polite about politicians, which is to say, I think one of the triumphs of political leadership in the post-crisis world is that we didn't see the surge of protectionism that you saw in the 1930s. And it's the sort of the dog that didn't bark, but we should actually celebrate that fact. We may not have made as much progress on trade initiatives as we would like, but we at least didn't go too far backwards and collapse into the kind of tit-for-tat war on protectionism that I think we could have ended up in. However, I don't think one can be at all complacent, particularly because one problem that in talking to politicians almost everywhere in the world is rising up the political agenda and is influencing the discussion around trade is that in most countries in the world, inequality is rising. Mm-hmm. And as inequality rises, a larger proportion of the population are saying, what's in it for us? It may sound good, all this trade stuff, for those at the top, but for the rest of us, we can't quite see what's in it. And I do think there is a political challenge, not just here, I think it's true everywhere, it's true in China, of being able to make the case and prove the point that globalization is not just good for the 1%, but that globalization actually is good for everybody.
I mean, that is obviously a particularly big challenge in America today, given this perception that jobs have been going to China, rightly or wrongly, and that, you know, essentially the manufacturing middle class has been hollowed out as a result of a rise in globalization, isn't it? I mean, what do you say when you speak to people in Utah or anywhere else who argue that actually, you know, globalization is not good, it doesn't work?
The reality for the United States is we've never been in a better position to compete. When you look at newfound raw materials, I mean, for Huntsman Corporation, you know, our price for raw materials is the equivalent of $15 to $20 barrel of oil economics. China's paying $100, the UK is paying $100. We in the United States on the manufacturing side are paying 15 to 20. This is the greatest gift we've been given as it relates to a newfound engine of growth. And as it relates to China, they begin to price themselves out of the market. You know, I serve on the board of Caterpillar and Ford Motor Company, among a couple of others. And if you would have told me that, you know, Caterpillar would have closed down a plant in Asia and reopened it in Georgia, I would have called you crazy a few short years ago. But the labor cost dynamics, the raw material advantage we have, the predictability of the marketplace, strong rule of law, commercial adjudication, access to strong markets around the world really gives us a preferred position if we see it as such. So I don't worry about our competitiveness. I worry a bit about the political rhetoric that is based on division as opposed to unity, which is a really bad thing for this country. And I worry a little bit about how we bring up the next generation of workers, how we give them skills and training and education beyond just the traditional four-year degree, because not everybody is going to go to a four-year degree institution, and how we align that with our industries of tomorrow, whether that will be biotechnology, which we will lead the world in for the next 100 years, whether it be in energy, which will be a huge industry of growth for this nation, or just basic manufacturing. So I'm an optimist in that regard, and losing jobs to China everywhere, that's yesterday's argument. We now have tomorrow to look forward to, and we're right in the driver's seat as that goes.
Jane, would you agree?
I do agree, and I'm looking at these amplifiers here. They say JBL. JBL is a Harman company. Harman is a New York Stock Exchange traded company that was founded by my late husband in another century, and that has manufacturing abroad. We were all founded in another century.
Those are good Huntsman products made out of it.
All righty. Abroad and here. And manufacturing has moved back and forth, but I think John makes the right arguments. We have the most innovative workforce. If we train kids using STEM skills and other skills to fill the jobs that come available, we're going to grow the jobs here. They're not going to go somewhere else. And there's, one problem, our broken immigration policy. It makes no sense whatsoever that 50% of the graduates of Caltech have to leave the country. Wouldn't it be smarter to have the right immigration policy so they could stay here and create jobs? They're the smartest products we're producing. I mean, some are American grown too, but hey, I mean, immigration is a fuel that this country should be using for our own growth, and we shortchange it by the failure of Congress to enact comprehensive immigration reform.
And do any of you have concerns that this idea that globalization is going to go in one direction might actually be wrong? Because, I mean, McKinsey has just come out with a fascinating study, which I think is being published today, which predicts that essentially globalization is just getting deeper and deeper, and I think they're suggesting it's going to triple the rate of globalization by 2025. And it's very much looking at this idea that due to digital technologies and supply chain linkages, we're all becoming more and more deeply integrated, and that can't be reversed. But of course, you do have something like the post-World War I, the post-Depression era, to act as a cautionary note from history. Are you at all concerned that this sort of confidence that globalization is going in one direction might be wrong?
Well, we will have our challenges along the way. There's no question about that. But we're fundamentally in a new era, and I think that new era started in spring of 1991 with the privatization of the internet. And as we see a new platform with which to market and sell and aggregate capital and distribute products, we're fundamentally in a new place. And I don't think we can accurately forecast or predict where this is going to go. We can accurately predict and forecast that there will be tension and fissures around the edges of globalization, but I think this is inexorable. This will continue. and it will continue to integrate regions. And I suspect that when we wake up in 50 years, we'll look at a strong Asia, but maybe even a stronger Indian Ocean with the rise of Africa and the subcontinent. I suspect that we will see the Americas, which will be 1 billion in population by 2050, more of an integrated market, particularly around energy, with Canada, Mexico, and the United States probably providing the vast percentage of resources necessary to fuel the global economy if we're smart enough to take advantage of it. And Europe will remain pretty much stagnant at 1 billion people by 2050. So we'll see some shifting, but globalization is inexorable, and I think it will produce some regional markets that are well beyond the isolated markets that we see today.
Could I just add to that? I think it's inexorable, and I think it's wonderful. And I think embracing it and shaping it is what nation states should be doing. Building barriers against it is counterproductive, and I think you've written about, is the nation state declining? And I think in some ways the role of the nation state, in some ways it should decline. It should train people for the global world. It should embrace people. For example, some of the fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. What an opportunity to reach for those economies and to connect them, if we're just talking about America, to America's exports. And to do some offshore work that grows the benefits for all people. I mean, what are the values that America stands for? The rule of law, of course, and opportunity here, but I think opportunity around the world. A peaceful world is good for business, and we really should get that. And globalization can be good for business. Let's understand that there's an underside. The underside is terrorism. The terrorists exploit globalization and ignore national boundaries, and there are threats. But again, if we live our values, that's the best way to win an argument with some kid in the boonies of Yemen trying to decide whether to strap on a suicide vest or join the global economy. And I would say we have a shot at winning the hearts and minds of that kid.
I'm going to be boring and agree that globalization is inexorable. It'll be driven by economics and technology. It's a great thing because it'll make people's lives wealthier and richer and build understanding. However, I don't think we should underestimate the degree to which vested interests in every country will fight back. And that will create all sorts of tensions and distortions. And actually, the vested interest that is probably the one that is most threatened by globalization are governments. Yeah. Because actually, globalization is quite subversive to national governments. And national governments, and this is true of both emerging market ones, but also of Western governments, find the power of the internet, the power of international business, the power of international financial markets really quite disconcerting because it makes it much harder for them to exercise their authority.
Right.
This comment on special interest is exactly right. And so what is the biggest challenge that at least one of them that Xi Jinping has now in China as he looks over the next few years? They're called state-owned enterprises. And so you look at China, probably 110 significant SOEs, of which 5 are the key players, the oil guys through the bankers and the exporters. And he'll be the first leader ever to stand up to what is the newest of phenomena in China, which are special interest players. They didn't have before, but now the SOEs are the special interest players in Chinese politics. And he'll have to tell them, no more writing the rules of the game like you have the last 10 years. You're going to have a new playbook, and your cost of capital is going to be different, and your transfer pricing economics internally will be, your price for raw materials will be different, and you'll have to have transparent governance going forward. Right. And all this will be hugely consequential, but it's the special interest players, I think, that will drag their feet ultimately with markets opening and markets integrating with the rest of the world. And that will not be an easy task.
But let's give some kudos to leaders who step up and face this.
That's right.
For example, Peña Nieto, the leader of Mexico, who is deregulating, or trying to, his energy market. Huge deal. And let's also put on the table the problem of corruption across so many governments. John just mentioned transparency. It's a huge problem in the Ukraine. If the West, as the West helps Ukraine, Ukraine has to clean up its own act. And it is very important that if there can be a fair election in Ukraine and at the end of May, that whatever government is elected is a government pledge to transparency. And most of the candidates are oligarchs from various segments of the economy. And those oligarchs didn't accumulate their wealth in a transparent way. But it is very important that they field a government that will clean this up for their country, or their country won't move forward. And that's true in many other countries, including in China, something that President Xi is working on.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn to the audience in a minute and give any of you who'd like to a chance to ask questions. But while you're just gathering your thoughts, I believe there are microphones in the hall. While you're gathering your thoughts, I'd just like to ask if any of you want to comment on Ukraine and the degree to which you think that may or may not put a spoke in the wheels of growth and excitement about the emerging markets this year. Are you concerned that talk about sanctions is going to undermine these trade flows, or that in general add to unease about the emerging markets? Peter, how's it looking?
Short answer is yes. A lot of people, even those who aren't directly connected, and we're not, our businesses in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, we're not really directly involved. We're thinking through the potential scenarios and what it could do to commodity pricing, energy pricing, the price of emerging market debt, the flows of money around the world. And it's very difficult to predict the consequences. Jane mentioned the tensions around between China and Japan earlier. Actually, if I talk to our corporate client base in Asia about what they're worried about, that's the one they're worried about. They're worried about some misunderstanding or mistake leading to two of the largest economies in the world getting into a situation which neither quite intended, but history tells us that accidents happen. So I think both the Russia-Ukraine situation and China-Japan situation, there is risk there which markets would react very, very strongly to. And I think one of the things that has changed since the crisis is now everybody's obsessed about black swans and fat tails, and we see them everywhere. Right? We all know that really, really bad things can happen. And I think a lot of people would react to a sharp deterioration in the Ukraine situation or some sort of incident between China and Japan, or more generally in the South China Sea, with a very, very strong market reaction.
Right.
You know, I'm a little more sanguine about the East China Sea for this reason. I think it's undergirded by strong trade, investment, and economics, all of Northeast Asia and even East Asia, and certainly Southeast Asia. And having lived in Taiwan twice in my life, I have to say that that was probably the most dangerous neighborhood in the world at one point, for all the reasons that we're talking about here today. But they problem solved. And they've got 350 flights per week back and forth. If you told me that when I lived there in the late 70s, I would have called you nuts. And if you told me that I'd lived long enough to see a free trade agreement between Taiwan and China, I would have called you totally certifiable. But that's where we are today. So there's an element of problem solving that goes on in the region. The unpredictable thing about Putin and you've got an element of megalomaniacal leadership, which doesn't exist in Asia, with the exception of North Korea and Kim Jong-un, but he's in a box. He can't move beyond certain parameters. With Putin, anything's possible because of his aspirations for a Euro-Asian empire with Moscow at the center. He has 110 billionaires in Russia today, all of whom have made a lot of money, mostly through gas and oil plays. And the question really will be, is it the 72% approval that he desires because of Crimea, or is it the backlash that the markets will likely articulate to him because of the outflow of capital and the diminution in the Moscow Stock Exchange, which lost probably 50 or 60 billion the first week of the debacle? People are going to speak up about that. But in the East China Sea, the war of words, of course, will be there. And there is, I think, deep animus between Abe-san and Xi Jinping for all kinds of reasons. It's generational, it's territorial, it's political, it's familial. But I think you've got an issue there that's played out since 1895 in some way, shape, or form. So the red lines are there. I think people know not where to cross because they would destroy the golden goose, the economy that keeps everybody going. I think Abe-san knows that. I think Xi Jinping knows that. The unpredictable element there really is an unintended incident in the air or the sea, because you've got probably half a dozen nations doing surveillance missions around those islands, whether Russia, Japan, Korea, the United States, China, even Taiwan. And that provides a traffic pattern on the sea and in the air that is a dangerous one. And there's no de-escalation strategy, is what I think is most alarming. I don't worry about the war of words. That'll be what it is. It's the misadventure.
So all those fishing boats and strange rocks really matter right now. I mean, the point about no de-escalation strategy is critical, having worked there myself. Jane, what do you think? I mean,
well, coming back to Ukraine, which was the original question, I am for tougher economic sanctions. I understand the short-term cost, but Vladimir Putin has not learned Colin Powell's Pottery Barn rule, sorry, Lillian, which is if you break it, you own it. And he now owns the broken economy of Crimea, and he's had to make efforts to bring Crimeans up to Russian economic standards, which are costing him a fortune. His stock market is tanking. John McCain is right that Russia is a gas station, in search of a country with massive corruption in the hands of these oligarchs, not all of whom live in the country. They hold up, they prop up or inflate the real estate markets, let's understand this, in New York City, London, and the south of France. So they lead good lives, they keep him in power. And it seems to me that the right tactic against a bully with grandiose visions is a serious and focused strategy where we put our strength against his weakness. What's our strength? Our economy. What's his weakness? His economy. And I think moving to, or almost moving to, and I would suggest moving to, sectoral sanctions against oil and gas, yes, will hurt short-term BP, Exxon, and some interests that matter to us. But they will, I think, cause him to change his behavior. And if his behavior changes, everybody wins. And that's a lot better than a land war or than Russian aggression across parts of Europe and possibly parts of Asia, which will be much more destabilizing in the medium and long term.
Right. I mean, that's fascinating. Just before I turn to questions, I'd like to actually just ask you all to do a little bit of work and say, how many people in the room right now believe that sanctions should be imposed in relation to Ukraine and Russia? Wow. That's a pretty strong show of support. I should have asked you first what you thought the answer would be, actually, and we can test you out. But
I'm very persuasive. I knew that.
Or we could have had a before and after vote. Secondly, I'm curious, how many of you are likely to be actually affected by sanctions? That's also quite striking. Right. Okay, well, on that note, I'd like to see if there are any questions from the audience. It would be courteous, but not compulsory, to identify yourself. Please keep your question very short, and if you'd like someone in particular to answer it, please indicate whom. But please, no long grandstanding statements, because we don't have very much time. Even on the Ukraine, especially on the Ukraine. Right, we have a question at the front. Do we have a microphone? So add to the suspense. Microphone's just coming.
I'm Riyaz Naqshbandi from American University, Gogad School of Business. The question is what you just mentioned about the emergence or the growing importance of emerging markets. How do you reconcile that with the less than desired involvement of emerging markets in managing financial institutions like the IMF and the World Bank?
So essentially, the question is, why don't the emerging markets have a bigger role in the IMF? Is that the question? Okay. Who would like to address IMF reform? Briefly.
Short answer is, I think they should have a louder voice, but I don't think we should just think about the IMF. I think if you, as a banker, things like the Financial Stability Board, the Basel Committee on Banking Standards, the dominant voices in there actually remain transatlantic voices, and we do need to get more representation and more articulation of the perspectives and needs of the emerging world across the international financial institutions.
Governor Huntsman, would you support, say, China having a bigger role at the IMF?
Well, inevitably they will. just based on the sheer size of the economy.
Just a little history here. I believe it was Tim Geithner, as Treasury Secretary, who suggested the IMF reforms that are now under review in the United States Congress, which would give emerging markets a bigger voice, and every other member of the IMF except for the United States has ratified those reforms. I think it's pretty boneheaded of us not to be doing this, and in a longer term, participation of the whole world, especially the increasingly successful parts of the whole world in international financial governance, helps everybody win.
Yeah, no, certainly the position does look rather odd at the moment on the part of Congress. Any more questions? We have a question over here. Microphone? Yeah, well.
It's coming through.
I'm Prakash Hinduja from Hinduja Group of Companies. I would like to put a question to Mr. Peter Sen. He mentioned about India and Indonesia election, about his experience in these two countries and with China, what he thinks comparing with China and India. As for the US trade, which is connected with the two countries which is going on, what would be your perception in the banking sector for these three places?
China, India, and Indonesia. Well, we are very fortunate as an institution in that we are the largest international bank in India, the second largest international bank in China, and I don't know, but we're probably the second or third largest international bank in Indonesia. So we've got big operations in all three countries, and I can get very positive about all of them. They are very different. China is by far the largest. I mean, make no mistake about it, China is in its own category as an emerging market because it is just so big. And is powering ahead. India, as you will know well, Prakash, has been through really quite a challenging 2 or 3 years. And this election is interesting because it could represent an interesting turning point in terms of the pace of the reform agenda. And India does have some great strengths. If you look out in the longer term, demographics plays to India's advantage much more than to China's. The English language actually is a great strength. And one of the things that India has, it's a sort of mirror image in some ways of China. China has actually fantastically effective bureaucracy and actually quite a nascent private sector economy. India actually has some very, very good private sector economies, and it has taken all the downsides of the British approach to bureaucracy and turned them into an art form. Indonesia actually is a country that I think most Western businesses and Western governments don't pay enough attention to. It's one of the largest countries in the world by population. It's actually got a very broad-based economy. It's been doing pretty well over the last few years. I can't call how this election will come out, but we could well end up with a more reforming, a more opening up, a more business-oriented government there. And actually, I think that's a very, very positive thing, not just for Indonesia, but for Indonesia's engagement with the rest of the world. So the opportunities for companies from the US and so on to do more, because it's a very large population who are increasingly wealthy and want to buy goods and services from the rest of the world.
So go to Indonesia. Yeah. Got a question here in the center. And again, if we can have a microphone.
Yeah. Sorry. My name is Stokes from Pan-African American Chamber of Commerce. I was at it when I knew that Africa has one of the fastest growing emerging markets. My question is, we have a lot of franchise in US, especially in Georgia, which seems to lead the world in franchise. Why are we also not exploiting that concept, taking franchise for aviation, pharmacology, telecommunications, and also what's been done to have leadership in renewable energy, which seems to be the way to go now, as against to drill, and how can we put this towards Africa and get into the emerging market and slowing down the space of China, which seems to be taking the lead right now. Thank you.
Would anyone like to address the question of how is America trying to counter the role of China in Africa? I think that was the question.
I'm sorry, I didn't get it.
How is America trying to counter the role of China in Africa?
Well, here's the problem. Here's the problem. China disperses money liberally in sub-Saharan Africa. And as a group of Western African ambassadors told me while living in Beijing, $1 billion here and $1 billion there actually solves some problems for us. You all come in and talk about human rights and a clean government and transparency, and that doesn't create jobs for us. So we have a problem. So here's the dilemma. We have a tradition of standing on a soapbox, which is probably our best and our worst characteristic as a country, and lecturing about values that are near and dear to us. And we're not going to change in that regard. That's just an expression of the American tradition in our founding documents. China, on the other hand, will go through a significant metamorphosis in terms of how they deal with the rest of the world. It will have to go from more transactional, which it is today. So we send 100,000 troops into Afghanistan, secure the country, lose a whole lot of lives and dollars in pursuit of our objectives, and China moves in and gets the mining concession. It's all transactional. And the biggest challenge for China, among others, will be how do you ascend to the world stage where they find themselves today, along with the United States, and how do you begin acting like a globally responsible player? How do you sit at the table of decision makers and talk responsibly about Syria, about Iran, about the East China Sea, about sub-Saharan Africa? So I suspect under Xi Jinping over the next 8 years, you're likely to see China move from more of a transactional dynamic, which is mostly 100% of what goes on in virtually every country of Africa, as I've tracked the investments and the trade that have played out in sub-Saharan Africa, to more of a responsible player, which is working with the United States, working with others in cleaning up hotspots, in dealing with insurgencies, in dealing with issues of health and the environment. I think that will likely be where China begins to make a transition, not because they want to, but there will be enormous pressure for them to be a more responsible player in that regard.
If I could just add something on Africa, though, I don't think our role is quite as dismal as John has portrayed it. For one thing, in northern Africa, where there is, in the Sahel region, an enormous increase in terror training and so forth, due in part to failing government, we are working to shore up those governments and to teach them political capacity skills. I think that's something very useful to do. I don't think their economies can succeed if there is not stability in the country. But the other thing is that China, so far as I know, in many parts of Africa, not only invests, but brings its own workers and then extracts resources from Africa. And that's resented in Africa. And it seems to me a much better strategy, one which we could pursue, and I hope we are pursuing, is to invest with Africa and to employ Africans in Africa as we invest and build resources and capacity there. And I think that will pay off robustly for the United States.
And listen, don't get me wrong on Africa. I think we've had some really profoundly important initiatives. The African Growth and Opportunity Act. You just look at the WAMU countries, the West African Monetary Union,
right.
From probably Senegal down to Nigeria. And there were a lot of good market opening measures, decent leaders who led the countries forward. And even in the South African Customs Union, South Africa, Namibia, Swaziland, Lesotho, and Botswana, which, is the oldest trade union in the world that goes back, to 1910. We attempted to negotiate, and I was overseeing Africa at the time at the trade office, a free trade agreement. We got so far, and that needs to be picked up on and moved forward because we need some examples of growth and economic integration on the continent that I think would be a very, very important next step.
One practical initiative which both EXIM Bank and Standard Chartered are involved in is the President's Power Africa, which he launched just under 12 months ago. And I think that's a very tangible one that is getting real traction because it's addressed at solving a real problem across Africa, which is that energy is scarce and it costs too much. And it's one that American technology can go a long way towards addressing. I think there's a broader issue about Africa that is that the demographics of Africa are such that Africa will be the biggest source of working age people over the next, I don't know what it is, 20, 30 years. To put this in perspective, Nigeria has as many children as the whole of the EU. So there's a phenomenal number of young people, which is either going to be a phenomenal asset if they can be skilled and given the opportunity to create livelihoods and jobs and so on, or it's going to be a huge problem, not just for Africa, but it's going to be a problem for the world. So I think the stakes are very high in terms of the way the rest of the world engages with Africa.
Right. Well, I know we have one more question, but sadly we are just about out of time, I'm afraid, so I do apologise for that. I think Peter's point actually sums up the sort of message of the panel rather well, which is that we are standing at a moment of growing globalization. You all assume that globalization is now unstoppable. You all assume that trade has potentially great benefits to bring America, and globalization and trade could be working in tandem to deliver great good. But as ever, politics remains the big question, and the question of whether this globalization is going to be used in a positive way or negative way still very much hangs in the balance. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for the panelists for a fascinating discussion. Thank you to the audience for voting, and best of luck in figuring it out.